Good morning. Thank you also very much for the invitation. If you live in Western Europe, you usually look to gambling regulation in your own country, in the EU, to Brussels, to Malta and Gibraltar. But I now learned from the invitation that we also have to look a bit more to the east, to your country, and that you have a lot of concern with gambling. Now, if you look at my title, I talk a bit, the whole presentation on responsibility and the question, who is responsible for what? That's a societal question because we have different ideas who should be responsible, the industry, the government, the individual. And over the centuries, we have different ideas on these issues in all other areas. This is not specific for gambling. And if you forgot all about my presentation in some minutes after I have finished, I want to give you two core messages to take at home. The first one is gambling regulation is not just a technology. It is based on a lot of different interests, societal interests, religious interests, academic interests, and systems, how to believe how this should work. And if you think of regulation only as a technical term, technical instrument, this is too short run. And you will always get problems, as you see when the gambling industry offers new systems and suddenly other people criticize it because there's no common understanding how should regulation work. The second message is responsible gambling, which is a type of training people to make informed choices, is not enough for a certain group, which I would call in the future vulnerable gamblers. You can do everything in responsible gambling. It will not help for this group. So these are the two core messages. This is my overview. I will talk first more on the first point and the second on these two different groups. Now, competing interests as usual. It's a bit complicated in Germany. To give you one interesting example, I receive money from the Bavarian Department of Health. This research money comes from the Bavarian Department of Finance directly. The Bavarian Department of Finance is the directly provider of the two monopolies, the casinos and the lotto. They are not only the provider, they are also their own regulation agency, and they are the regulation agency for the private competitors. So a very interesting complex of interests. Now, if you start from the very basics, we have some questions and still some countries discuss on that. And for example, in our country, we still discuss, should we have monopolies on that? We have two major monopolies. Should we forbid, for example, internet gambling? There are still monopoly providers in Germany who think we should forbid that on the long run and reinforce this forbid. So it's a societal decision. It's not of industry, of whatever. It's a societal decision. And all have some disadvantages and advantages. Whatever you do, you will have some possible things and some negative. But one is clear, if you implement gambling, you need a strict and comprehensive public control. This is imperative. Without control, you see all the problems which come up. Now, what are some ideas? What are the societal aims? The first is to provide entertainment. But this is also already put in question by some societal stakeholders. So if industry says we want to provide entertainment, you have to find some agreement with people who doubt that and who say gambling is nothing else than exploiting people from their money. And research can contribute to that. Entertainment is part of it and sometimes problems. Now, to generate income, to generate taxes for what we call in Germany the public good, but also minimize social negative impact and individual and family harm. So there's no perfect solution for these 5 aims. You always have to wait, and there's no gambling without problems, however, also problems without gambling. So in this tightrope walk we handle, and there's only a stepwise optimization. Now, if we go on regulation, what do we want to regulate? The first area, fraud protection. I will not go in detail, that's not my topic. The second is use protection. The third is responsible gambling activities for the majority of people. And the last one, which I will continue later on, is player protection for those who are not able to gamble in a responsible way. Now, what is the scientific background for this separation? You could say responsible gambling is enough for everyone. It's his personal responsibility. Now, you see gambling is an activity all over Europe. It includes all types of gambling, legal and illegal, and you come in most countries above 50%. Now, if you look on the disorders, you all know these figures, huge difference between disorder prevalences and gambling prevalences, even if we keep in mind that there's a lot of underestimating, but also overestimating of the screening instruments. So it's a rough guess, not more. And interesting is, these are the German figures. We have data since 10 years, and the same colors are the same methodology, and there is, in principle, no change over the years, despite all the big changes. Now, the question is, how to explain this discrepancy? Why this 0.5% or 1%, it doesn't matter, or 2%, get a problem and the others not? It's the classical question, like with alcohol or other drugs, why do some people get problems? Usually a small group, absolutely a huge group, so it's a public health problem, but relatively to the activity, a small group. Well, usually we have 3 answers. It's individual factors. The second is it's environmental factors, or it's something which is related to the game itself. It's more dangerous games or less dangerous games. The relative importance of these figures are known. Probably, and this is the core of my topic, individual vulnerability is probably dominant, because we have at least in Germany and probably in your country, we all have access to the same gambling things, to what is seen more dangerous or less dangerous, but we don't develop problems. 80% in Germany drink alcohol, less than 10% get a problem. So, and alcohol is always accessible. So probably, and that's the hypothesis, vulnerability is the core factor, and vulnerable people, if they then come in excess with gambling, they can't handle it anymore. Now, what is vulnerability? This is not a specific gambling-specific term. It was developed in the research over the last 10, 20 years as a factor to explain why some people get mental problems and some others. You could also use it for somatic concepts, for somatic diseases, because we all know that, for example, smoking causes cancer, but the risk to develop a cancer is different between individuals. So that's a very general term, vulnerability, and it's a mixture of innate and acquired risk factors that if you have an external stressor, higher the probability to development, in our case, a mental disorder. There are some knowledge from that area, facets of vulnerability. They have a neurobiological background. I won't go in detail. They have, for example, a dysregulation of reinforcement systems, so people look for strong reinforcements. We have a reduced level of cognitive control, that these people who first do something and then think if it was good or not. And it has psychological basis, like Mark already explained, the high level of mental disorders. Now, that's a ideal, let's say a vulnerable gambler with neurobiological characteristics and psychological characteristics. And the basic is a lack of control and a lack of understanding the consequences of one's own behavior. So you don't react on punishment as normal people. If you go in a casino and lose 2,000 euros in a night or 10, you would stop and don't do it again. A vulnerable gambler doesn't think of these consequences. He has the hope, because there are other ideas also, he can regain it next day. Now, how do we put that together? Because we know in our age of adolescence, we all did crazy things. Usually it stops after some time, and some, for example, develop an alcoholic disorder. And like Mark says, we should divide the development from non-gambling to addictive gambling in different steps. What I call risky gambling or harmful, and then dependent gambling. And the idea behind this, that at the beginning, especially in adolescent and young adults, you have a dominance of adolescent factors. You have a second vulnerability there, because you have in adolescence a change of the whole brain system. And unfortunately, power and willing to do things independent from your parents are much faster developed than cognitive control, especially in male person. Cognitive control takes some time, often 20 to the age 20, 22. For some, never. It never ends the development of cognitive control. And so you have a certain vulnerability in that age, which disappears over time. And then the development to develop a disorder is based from that model on individual vulnerabilities. And that explains why when I talk about target groups, I talk about 3 target groups. The minors, because we should not forget them. Like in all other areas, they need an early education and information about gambling, like about alcohol, tobacco, or smoking. We have social gamblers, the large group, and we have the high-risk vulnerable gamblers. Now, based on that, who bears responsibility? The individual, the provider, the regulation authority? Sometimes it's interesting to go back in political history and societal history. And we have this extreme between laissez-faire, you are extreme self-responsible, and the other side, the nanny state, very paternalistic government, and the public knows what's good for you. And the theory of liberty of Mill helps a lot to go a bit more in detail. And in principle, he says individuals are free and responsible for what they provide in the market as a market participant, personal satisfaction. But already he set some limitations. And the first one was risk for others. You have to regulate. The next one was risk for incapable people. Regulation is accepted. Mental disorders, things like this, minors. And probably we include there vulnerable gamblers. And risk for oneself, this is very much debated. Who is responsible for your own behavior? It's a controversial social debate. At least he also accepted if there is a market with asymmetric information, and that's in the gambling field, because The gambling provider knows nearly everything on his gambling. He knows perfect. In internet gambling, he knows even your behavior. But the consumer has a limitation of information. And from that background came the idea of consumer education and consumer protection as a basis to make a market participant as powerful as the market industry. Especially in post-war, Second World War development of modern consumer protection, it was developed, and you see it in the EU in many different areas. For example, if you take, if you want a loan for buying a house, in future times, they look, you have money in the bank, and then you make your signature, and you got the money. Today, you have to be informed about a lot of issues. For example, that you pay more interest than the amount of the loan if you have it over 30 years or 20 years. So there is a lot of consumer protection to make you idealistic, as powerful as the banks. Now, the idea behind this, to strengthen individual responsibility, to have informed choice, but protect the vulnerable, who is not able to do this informed choice. Now, we have a different shared responsibility. The individual, to be informed, he should also inform, but he should be able to be informed, to make informed changes, and to make his entertainment within economic time and social limits. The society, the regulation authority, to control, to sanction, to protect minors and vulnerable gamblers, and the provider to implement all the things which are necessary for consumer protection, responsible gambling, and for the vulnerable gambling. Now, youth protection, that is very much undervaluated in the current discussion, because we usually say, okay, we forbid gambling for youth people. But that's not enough. When I was young, it was normal to play in this German-type amusement machines with some money. Nobody cared. So I developed with my parents my father, some technology in doing that. So the necessary thing is, like, you could think of sexual education or alcohol and things like this. We need not much more effort in this area, but this is not my topic so much. Now, you all know the concept of responsible gambling. The target is to support informed choice. There was a lot of development, and I don't have to go in detail of that. You all know it. In principle, the idea is decision to gambling is individual choice of responsibility, and to make proper decisions, industry has to provide adequate information. There was a lot of activities and developments over the years in this area. So the idea is the individual who gambles gets enough information. He gets also feedback. And as a recent development, he gets also the possibility to make a self-exclusion, which I was very much, I liked very much the presentation of my colleague at the beginning about this very differentiated offers for self-exclusion in terms of time, money, period, and things like this. In Germany, for example, we don't have it. If you self-exclude, you do it lifelong. The consequence is nobody does it. Now, player protection. If we agree that there are people who are not able, as vulnerable person, if they come for the first time to gambling, and in this interaction then of gambling and vulnerability develops this gambling disorder, or the high risk of developing a gambling disorder, the most important thing is early detection. Now, we all know there's a lot of research, if you think of Howard Scheffer and others, on online gambling. But at least still in our country, land-based gambling without any data control is the predominant type of gambling, and there, early detection, it's much more difficult. There's a lot of ideas and screening instruments and things like this, but there's a very low level of scientific evidence how to do it in detail. If you have, if we talk about internet offers, it's much easier. You could give personalized feedback, you can give warning messages. And the idea is that you keep as long as possible your individual decision making. So at the beginning, you make warnings, you give options to reduce as you detailed it. And if this does not work and it needs a good tracking, the final end would be obligatory limit agreements. So the gambler must agree on some limits, but still chosen by the gambler. And the end is the forced exclusion, which is again to be debated because it's a heavy influence in your individual freedom, forced exclusion. So again, this has to be debated, and there's a need for more research on this. Now, I will skip that to keep in time and go to the conclusions. Now, degree and type, that's what I started, is a societal debate. Prohibition and regulation, whatever you choose, both have advantages and disadvantages. Any type of license needs public regulation and strict control. The risk factors are predominantly individual-based. We have to do much more for minors, not only forbid that, but to do education. We have the social non-vulnerable gamblers with information to make informed choices and give them feedback. And we have the vulnerable adults which need protection because they can't profit from responsible gambling. And as a researcher, you always end, we have several research needs in this area. For example, for make it a bit more easier, I made a strict differentiation between controlled gamblers and vulnerable gamblers. And the concept behind is that you develop this in early childhood and adulthood, and so that you get rather early these problems when you start gambling. But we have not enough knowledge if vulnerability probably develops over the age, for example, with severe life incidents, and that you can develop problems also in older ages when you probably start gambling. Okay, thank you.